Sarah Morgan. You're up.
Oh, thank you.
Is that your middle name?
Sarah, no.
I was like, see, I told you.
Why'd you have
so.
Sarah Morgan?
That's what you called it.
That's what I called it?
Yeah.
That's weird. I created like a Google
gonna tell
account
Morgan
for the
you got her on the
office for Residence Life because that's a long story, but I called it like Residence Life, and Google's like, you're not a real person. So I took my first name and the other assistant director's first name and I made an account. Someday we'll leave, no one will ever understand why the account is linked to that. So I just start? Alright, so I looked at how living learning communities contribute to students' transition to college, and let's just find our flock and get right down to it. So introductions. Transitions result in a change in assumptions about oneself and the world, and thus requires a corresponding change in one's behavior and relationships. In our lifetime, we're going to go through a lot of transitions. Some of them are active transitions, others are more passive. College is definitely a milestone or significant transition for a lot of folks. You're moving away probably for the first time. Even if you're attending a school like UNF, like maybe you live on Kernan, but you still have to live on campus, that is still change, and you're going to meet new people, and your social network is going to change, and how you understand those relationships is going to change. And there's a really high stakes in whether students are successfully transitioning to college, because that's related to student success and ultimately retention. If you're in a state like, say, Florida, that is a big deal because that's one of the key matrices used to evaluate whether you should receive performance-based funding. So there's a really high stakes game in creating the kind of environments on campus that are going to support student transitions, living learning communities. And I know I've kind of told you about them a lot, but in case you forgot, living learning communities are the kinds of environments colleges are trying to foster because they're believed to support student success and transition by helping people create social networks because you're living with other people and you're taking a shared class probably with someone with shared interests. And so you're finding your niche on campus, and the hope is that will help you transition to college in a more fluid way and stay and graduate and get the school money because we care about you as a human being, of course. I really like this picture because I think it really encapsulates moving day. Like, who knows what he's doing, but mom's doing all the work. All right, so the problem statement. So there's some research out there that kind of talks about the promise of these kinds of communities, but living learning communities, like a lot of other things as it relates to our understanding of how students transition to college, there's a lot of like trust and hope that these programs are doing what they're doing, but there isn't necessarily always a lot of research or data kind of to support those findings. And I think if we're going to kind of create the time and attention that it takes to create these types of programs, we should actually measure to see if they're doing what they're doing. One, because I think it's an important outcome for students. It's a big step for students when they come to college. We want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to make that a successful step for students, but then also these types of programs tend to take a lot of time and resources. So are they an appropriate use of those things? And so I wanted to do that. So I created these following research questions. And it was to kind of look at living learning communities' impact on first-year college student transitions at a mid-sized public institution in the Southeast. What school could that be? So does participating in living learning community positively impact student social transition, but then also their academic transition, which are two key types of transitions that tend to emerge in the research. And so I wanted to kind of focus on these 2 points or types of transition. And so talking about our theoretical framework and literature, these folks are excited about it, so I won't hold it back anymore. So there are 2 theoretical frameworks that I utilized. One is Schlossberg's transition from transition to adaptation, there we go. And what she talks about is there are 3 main factors that contribute to your transition. And this is for any life event. It could be marriage, going to college, the death of a parent, it could be anything. So perception of that particular transition, the characteristics of that environment that you're engaging in that transition, and also the characteristics of that individual. And so watch out for this. Please look up if you're on a computer Animation. So this one's focusing on, what I want to focus on are the characteristics of this specific environment, because that's what living learnings are trying to do. They're trying to create specifically structured environments to facilitate this transition. So support systems, so those are our social networks. Those for a student could be existing relationships that you have, but then also hopefully the new ones that you're going to make when you come to college. Institutional support, so and these would be all kinds of agencies on a college. They can be a particular office, a faculty member, an RA, a hall director. There's a lot of different institutional supports that could be in place, and then the physical setting itself. So living environment, what does the room layout look like? What do the lounge spaces look like? How close is the classroom? Those are all things that LLCs try to manipulate to facilitate student success. And so by utilizing this in my theoretical framework, I could infer that if this environment is having an impact in this way, it could be supporting students' transition. I also utilized a second framework called the IEO model, and I don't know why they didn't come up with a better name for this title, because it just literally steals from like the three components of the theoretical framework. And what it talks about is that student input, so those could be characteristics about the student, so their age, sexual orientation, are they a first-generation student, their ethnicity. Those contribute to how we engage with our environment, so our lenses in the world, how do we see things, how do we interpret things, which could ultimately then impact student outcomes like transition. And then they can also just directly impact the student outcomes as well. So the idea is that if you can make changes in the environment, you could potentially improve the outcomes for students, and that is the goal. And so that's kind of how I link it back to student outcomes. And this is Aston's model, and he specifically looked at college environments when developing this model, so it's even more appropriate. And this is probably the most common model you'll see in the research when assessing these types of programs. So, literature review. The National Center for Living Learning Programs, the NSLOP, is the largest and only longitudinal study that's out there right now about living learning communities. And Inglis is one of the main authors. You see her name all throughout the research, because like she's living my dream. Like, she did this one big study, and like there's a lot of other studies that she put on after this from this data set. But they surveyed over 24,000 students across the U.S. at multiple institutions. They looked at both students who live in these types of programs and those who did not, and they created some cross comparisons about outcomes that those students attained. And they found that they were linked to engagement, increased critical thinking skills, and a smoother academic and social transition. And then several spin-off studies looked at specialized populations, so looking at first-generation students, women who participate in STEM living learning communities. All of them found an increase in kind of those kinds of areas like critical thinking and transition. And I think it also kind of highlights that these programs can potentially be particularly helpful for students who may be at risk for not succeeding in college. There are also some smaller scale studies that looked at like maybe an individual program or maybe one campus that had a couple different programs. And generally the outcomes were positive, and they were able to attribute to student success and transition, but not exclusively. I did find one study, it was an aviation LLC, which may be kind of disturbing. Because what if I used to have a friend who was a pilot, and she's like, do you want me to go out and drink with you, or do you want me to study? Because I could be your pilot someday. I'm like, okay, Sheila, you can stay in tonight. But they found that the students in that study enjoyed a higher GPA their first year, but not necessarily any kind of difference in retention of those students. So that LLC may not actually be contributing to students' transition. And then in kind of a different line in the literature, one study, and that was the one I did for my article critique, kind of talked about a lot of the times in research you read that they tend to clump all LLC students together, like the NLLP kind of did that, or they look at just one particular LLC and they don't really kind of account for the characteristics of that LLC, so the nature of the partnership between academic and student affairs who facilitate these programs, whether they're classrooms, and what kind of the physical characteristics of the environment are, because that really can impact the outcome of those programs. So, okay, research design. This is like a mouthful. I did a quantitative quasi-experimental non-equivalent control group post-test design only. And maybe you remember that citation and what these things look like. So traditionally this design would include
Center X.
Center X, that's an X. That'd be the intervention.
No, it looks like tic-tac-toe.
Oh, Center X. Sorry, I already won. But a lot of times this research design would include a pre-test. And that's probably a good idea for future research. I assume no significant variation in input characteristics of participants based off of the results of that national study, which actually found that there's really no major differences of input characteristics of students who participate in LLCs and non. But I think for a study in the future, it would probably be beneficial to improve the robustness and validity. But I'll get to that later. All right. So participants, all first-year students at a mid-sized regional institution in the Southeast United States. So that was about 1,800 students who lived this past fall, 233 of which are LLC participants. And they were invited via email to take the Community Evaluation Survey, or CES. They were invited via email. They had 2 weeks to complete it. They got a reminder about it. It's a relatively short survey with 32 liquor and free response essays, questions. And really the intent of the survey is to ascertain student satisfaction with the student staff member they worked with or have for the community, and some kind of overall characteristics about their perceptions about living on campus. In the end, after removing partially completed surveys, that left me with 215, 44 of which identified as LLC students. It's problematic to compare large groups to small groups. So to kind of mitigate this and improve my robustness, I took a random sample of 44 non-LLC participants to compare to those who identified in an LLC. All right, so similar to what Nick did, I took key questions from that survey to develop just a holistic measure of those two questions I have. One is social transition, the other is academic transition, and these provide a great look at what kind of questions those were. So I feel like UNF is a home for me. Living on campus has enhanced my ability to improve interpersonal relationships. So these are all key characteristics linked to one, social transition, and then academic transition. I've had interactions with faculty outside the classroom. Programs were interesting in my community, and living on campus supports my academic goals. Both scales reveal the Cornbrett's offer reliability above a 0.7, which is great news, which means we get to use them. I know you're all excited about this. Oops. So first I started with exploratory statistics. Within that I identified a few outliers, which I ultimately decided to remove, 2 from each group, which actually left me with 42 in each of my sample groups. And sad face, the data appeared to be extremely negatively skewed. So I had to do a reflect inverse transformation of the data.
Gee, are you shocked?
And I was able to achieve normal distributions, which meant I was able to move forward because I met all the assumptions, and utilize an independent sample t-test to compare both. So I ran 2 different t-tests for each of the 2 different questions. And so these are the results I had. These kind of just describe some of the exploratory statistics that I got. The mean between the 2 for social transition, it's actually lower for students who participate in an LLC. And it's pretty close for academic, but LLC participants got a slight boost, but the differences are actually not that great, including when you look at the standard deviation. And then for the independent samples t-test results, the mean difference actually is not statistically significant for either question. So there's really no significance in those differences, which maybe the person who works with these LLCs on a regular basis had these feelings on the inside when they saw these statistics. Well, in complete transparency, like we're starting to look at some broader data about these programs who have been on for about 4 years. So we're starting to look at some of the broader retention data, and these findings are actually kind of consistent with what we're seeing as far as like 4-year retention rates and things like that of these students. But the results were unanticipated in light of the trends articulated by the literature. But again, there was that study that also found the same thing. And so I'd be interested to go back maybe in the future because GPA is not available for fall 16. I don't even know what my GPA is going to be for fall 16. So it could be kind of a way to go back and look. Historical data has suggested that students in LLCs at this institution have been average higher than non-LLC participants. And I think it encourages definitely additional study into specific characteristics of these programs and maybe a reevaluation of the resources and nature of the collaborations as those have been linked to actual outcomes for these types of programs. Limitations. So assuming input is probably a big limitation and for future research it would probably be beneficial to kind of look to see and control for these factors, especially when you consider the theoretical framework I utilized for this study. And a pretest would also further help control for that, to know if that might potentially be influencing these results. And then the sampling was not random, definitely limiting the external validity of my study. So conclusions, assume nothing. So these programs have the great potential, and there's a lot of great research out there that backs that they have the capability to improve students' transition to college. But just because you have a program doesn't mean you're doing what you think you're doing. And so you owe it to yourself and your students and your institution to make sure that your program are achieving these things. And when not, it's okay. You just got to go back and take a look at some things. I really like this. This is my favorite sentence of the whole paper that I wrote. So I decided to share it with you. When functioning at their peak, living learning communities operate counter to traditional institutional cultures in higher education. There are a lot of silos in higher education. Faculty don't tend to work with student affairs staff. What happens in the residence halls don't tend to connect for students about what's happening in the classroom. And in an ideal sense, these programs intentionally merge these two worlds, which is great. But because it kind of goes against the grain, there's a lot of pitfalls for why these programs may not be successful, which is why I think it's so important to continue to look at these programs both now and in the future, because they have great potential, but they don't happen easily and they take a lot of work. And it also takes a lot of buy-in. So generating data can also help sway faculty or student affairs leadership that these are programs worth spending time on. And these are my references. Enjoy.
Tinto.
Tinto's in there.